Certain places in history operate less like institutions and more like crossroads. Spaces where ideas that feel impossible in one era quietly become inevitable in another. The Highlander Folk School is one of those places. If you've ever wondered how ordinary people learn to challenge systems that seem immovable, segregation, labor exploitation, voter suppression, Highlander is part of that history and that story. Founded in 1932 in the mountains of Tennessee during the Great Depression, it didn't begin with the civil rights movement. It began with labor, with workers, with the idea that democracy wasn't just something you voted for, it was something you practiced together. And what makes Highlander fascinating isn't just who passed through the doors. Though the list is extraordinary, Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, Septima Clark developed citizenship schools that would go on to teach thousands of Black Americans how to read, write, and register to vote in the Jim Crow South. The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee founded ground there. Labor organizers, Appalachian activists, immigrant leaders, environmental justice activists, generation after generation have called Highlander home. But Highlander was never simply about training leaders. It was about creating space for people to see themselves as leaders. And that idea, that leadership is something collective, something cultivated, is still radical. Because we tend to tell history as if movements are driven by individual heroic figures. But places like Highlander remind us that movements are ecosystems. They're built in rooms where people sit in circles, argue, sing songs, share food, and wrestle with ideas late into the night. They're built through relationships. And Highlander itself has had to survive. It was targeted during the Red Scare. The state of Tennessee tried to shut it down, which raises a bigger question that feels present today. What does it actually take to sustain movements over generations? Not just spark them, sustain them. That's why I'm really excited for this conversation today, because we're not just talking about history, we're talking about an institution that is still actively shaping organizers, still experimenting with democratic practices, still asking what liberation looks like in the 21st century. So I want to introduce someone who is carrying that legacy forward, not as a museum curator of the past, but as a practitioner in the present. And that's Allyn Maxwell Steele, the co-executive director of the Highlander Research and Education Center. Welcome to Learn Something New Today, a podcast where we democratize history. Today we have our special guest, Allyn Maxwell Steele. He is the co-executive director of the Highlander School, the legendary Highlander School. Thank you for coming today.
It's great to be here on the podcast and to get to meet you, Anthony. Thanks so much for having me.
Well, thank you. Give us a breakdown of what the Highlander is before we get into the questions.
Yeah, totally. So Highlander is a school, like you said. It's a school that very simply works to support grassroots leaders and social movements through catalytic change work, right? So what we seek to be is a catalyst for grassroots leadership and social movements in the U.S. South and Appalachia. Highlander's been doing that since 1932. Originally, we were called the Highlander Folk School, and there's a long story to that and to why we had to change our name. These days, formally we go by the Highlander Research and Education Center, and but folks just call us Highlander. Sometimes we get called the Movement School or Highlander Center, but you can just call us Highlander.
Awesome. So let's start with the questions here.
Sure.
When you guys were founded by Miles Horton, right? He was one of the early organizers. And I mean, based on his founding vision, what do you feel like he understood about social change that we are at risk of losing today?
So Miles and the other founders, Don West and Jim Dombrowski, and there were kind of a constellation of supporters, really saw that a innate brilliance and wisdom of people, of all people, it was foundational to social change work. So, like a recognition of that innate wisdom and innate brilliance, right? So, people are experts in their own lived experiences. That doesn't mean they know always how to make sense of those experiences in a way that will transition or translate into like a campaign that will build power or change the power structure in a local or state or national or international context. But it's fundamental to the worthiness or to the question of, why do we work with regular people, and what's our own sense of our own dignity. It's a belief in the it's a belief and a recognition that people know what they need, and what they need also is accompaniment in transforming the material conditions that we've inherited into the ones that we believe we deserve. So I think that the thing that gets lost a lot of times is that the inherent wisdom, dignity, brilliance of working people, of regular people, is central to the love affair that you have to have, so to speak, with social change work through dealing and working with people. Like you have to have that. I think we've lost sight of that. Not really in always in social movements, but I think that the question of people's inherent dignity is really at risk in terms of public consciousness, and certainly within political and economic leadership of our era.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Absolutely. Now, you had mentioned regular people. Now, you guys, of course, train regular people, but you guys have had some big players come through in the grand scheme of things, and you guys are also the infrastructure of the civil rights movement, was part of the infrastructure of the civil rights movement. Rosa Parks, there's an infamous photo of Rosa Parks, Martin Luther King, Septima Clark, that came through and taught and gave lessons and learned from the Highlander Center. So your role was more infrastructural. How do you think about the power of institutions that quietly shape movements without being the public face of them?
I love that question. I think I do believe that the role was both and is both infrastructural, but it's also about, and it's about, and I say this in the broadest definition of the term, with principles in mind. Like, it's an ecological approach, right? Like that, we build infrastructure, we support the creation of infrastructure, but Highlander also pays attention, and I think the best organizing in education pays attention to what is, right? And in paying attention to the ecological relationships, so to speak, between people in place, between communities, between cultures, that is where the noticing and the sort of accompaniment really begins. So I think the infrastructure piece, though, I think it matters, because I think, quietly speaking, or like speaking of being like quiet about it, the educator's role is certainly to lead in a non-neutral way. I don't think that the way that education, or the way that educator has been sort of neutralized in public consciousness, is not really our jam. We believe that there's no neutral education. There's no depoliticized educational process. That if you're sharing information, and if you're supporting people's skills development, and you're building relationships between people and supporting the relationship building between people, then it's inherently political, not necessarily partisan, but inherently political. The question for Highlander, though, is not how we can toot our own horn in doing that bridging work, or that political education work, or popular education work. It's more about, how do you center the leadership of people most impacted by a particular issue or set of issues. And I think that's really central too. It's that, like, the leadership of people who are most impacted by an issue needs to be centered, and also needs to be supported, celebrated, and there needs to be infrastructure built to support them and celebrate them. And that's spade work that is not particularly glamorous. It's not particularly sexy. It's a lot of meetings. It's a lot of questions around resource allocation. It's a lot of questions around relationship building. It's a lot of
Hmm.
hits and misses. It's a lot of
Absolutely.
experiments. Yeah, so that work isn't always. It's not that it's secret. It's just more that it's harder to capture that kind of work
Right.
in a typical like narrative fashion that our culture has typically moved us into thinking, like one person or
Right.
one hero or that kind of thing. Yeah,
It's more.
that's not.
It's
Yeah,
moving parts. It's a lot of logistics and
yeah,
the messy stuff that really no one wants to celebrate.
yeah. It also it demystifies the sort of cultural trope of like the individual savior. When
Right.
you have like a whole lot of people who've all had their hands in it, or all spoken or sung together to create a transformative moment that then leads to sort of policy change, then it it should be an invitation to people who don't ever see themselves or may never be seen as quote unquote famous or
Right.
heroic to be part of a bigger something. And that's hard for our minds sometimes to grapple with, because we're taught and trained to think of the individual. We're taught
Right.
and trained to think of the charismatic leader. And while I don't dismiss the importance of individual leadership, what it really takes to mobilize and catalyze big transformative gains like the Black freedom struggle or civil rights movement did, is a whole mess of people,
Right.
with a whole lot of roles. Yeah.
As I study civil rights and the civil rights movement, and do interviews like this, I realize the organization that it took that's not talked about. And it's
Right.
something that I see today is that, like you mentioned, the individual savior. There's so many people that want to be that individual savior, but not realizing that there was a structure to the civil rights movement, and everyone played a part in it, regardless of what they were in the socioeconomic grasp of things.
Right.
Do you feel like that is something that's missing today?
I think there's a real key. Well, I think one thing I'd add to what you just said is that not everybody agreed, right? There is an sort of a nostalgic a nostalgic temptation is maybe the best way to say it, to to say, well, everybody was in unity, or everybody was in unity then around this particular methodology for creating change, or this particular tactic or strategy for creating change. And therefore, until we reach unity today, we are not going to be able to move. I think when you study like you have, and what we try to do with people is that alignment is more significant than unity, right? If
Right.
if
Right.
we're recognizing that we have a common
Goal.
opponent,
Hmm.
and then yeah, we have a common opponent or we have a common set of conditions, then it's more important for us to be aligned with our ability to move to affect and shift those conditions, to build power if it's power building, to block things if it's about blocking death dealing policies or practices. Like we can all get aligned around that. I think that is something that in the last several years, I think particularly with the crisis of the authoritarian moment that we're in, and the long kind of building and growing of that, more and more people are recognizing that alignment right now to block and to resist really does take precedent. That doesn't mean that people don't want to or shouldn't be paying attention to what we're trying to build beyond this moment, but I do think that I think more and more people are getting that in the face of this sort of significant, relatively organized, although vulnerable for sure, opposition and authoritarian administrative kind of like regime at all levels, that it matters about how we try to get in step with each other. And I think that was true for the civil rights movement. I think that was true
Yes.
for the labor movement that Highlander accompanied in still does, but it accompanied more directly in its earliest days. Um,
Absolutely.
yeah, yeah,
So, Highlander is not without its controversy. I was reading that you guys were targeted, raided, and shut down during the civil rights era. I believe after as well. Correct me if I'm wrong. What did the repression, the state repression, teach you about organization and
Mm,
power, and about
mm.
the risks that come with challenging this system?
Yeah. Yeah, I'll first zoom in on the on what you referenced at the beginning around the in 1959 it was there was a raid um, on Highlander's original home place during a workshop that Septima Clark and others were leading for young people who were part of the civil rights movement or part of the Black freedom struggles, mostly if not exclusively young Black people. And that raid was initiated through a Tennessee legislative resolution to investigate Highlander for its quote unquote, like basically it's a range of different things, but like it was prompted by uh, the the Red Scare and people like having a particular take on communism and communist organizing, and it was also a way to be more directly in smear campaign against the Black freedom struggle. Because Dr. King had been a guest speaker at Highlander 2 years prior to 1959 and 1957, which was Highlander's 25th birthday anniversary party. And so we still have an anniversary gathering annually. And that, if you look up Highlander and Dr. King, et cetera, you'll see people can see the billboards that were trying to um, posture Dr. King as someone who's attending a quote unquote communist training school, and in that sense delegitimize the entire Black freedom struggle. Um, there are times when I've been in this conversation and heard people try to associate anything with communism as if communist organizing is inherently bad. I think that Highlander's never taken a position that that is real. Highlander has had people from the very beginning who uh, were socialists, communists, Democrats, Republicans, people who thought about capitalism in some ways, people who thought about capitalism in very different ways. I think Highlanders always tended to favor social democracy and democratic democratization of all systems, and I think that capitalism doesn't really allow for that. So, in that sense, Highlanders always existed as a sort of working against, if not trying to work beyond, the economic system of capitalism. So, I think that what King was starting to do was draw connections between the economic conditions of all people, but particularly Black folks in the South, alongside questions of um, electoral democracy and representation and civil rights and et cetera, right? So even though in the late 50s, King wasn't exactly as forthright publicly about his position on the economic realities of the U.S. at the time, the way that the state was concerned about like Black liberation, at least from the electoral side, the civil rights side, they were hip to the question of, oh my gosh, this Black leader is working with folks who have been pushing for decades, alongside many other people, an alternative economic system to capitalism, and that that was what led the state of Tennessee, among other things, to attack Highlander and revoke our original charter, the Highlander Folk School. That's when we were a Highlander Folk School, confiscate the land, etc. Both before that and since then, but particularly before that, Highlander is always under like red baiting or scrutiny for integration work. Like Highlander didn't start out like immediately bringing Black and white people together. There's a bit of a convenient mythology around that Highlander's always been an interracial place. That's not the aspirations, I believe, of the founders were to like no, we can't have a real robust, powerful worker movement and labor movement if we don't do it interracially.
Hmm.
But that doesn't mean that did not really come into full effect until like a few years after Highlanders started, that they started to have interracial workshops. But that was really what, that pressed the chord, is like combination of like bringing black and white people together to do scary things like learn and read and swim and eat and sing together, all the way to having conversations, open conversations about what's the world that we people really deserve, all done in fact under the in the earliest years. It was really done under like the auspices of the social gospel. A lot of the founders were Christian seminarians or interested in the way of applying the teachings of Jesus to like real life stuff in the South. So you know the controversy is really something that I think is a representation of the status quo's fear of its own loss of power and its own loss of centered, white supremacist and white capitalist and white patriarchal like centrality to the way that the U.S. should run. And
Absolutely.
Highlander has always confronted that. So,
Absolutely. Now, you guys started off as a labor organizing movement, and you brought together labor organizers, civil rights activists, and later environmental and immigrant justice leaders. Were there moments where people from different movements influenced each other in unexpected ways?
yeah, I mean, I think a bit of just a modest reframing of what you just said is that Highlander started out to be a school to transform the current social order at the time to a new social order.
Hmm.
Like, so one venue for that was working people in labor, and worker organizing. Highlander also did other things like in its earliest days, it did a lot of community development work, right? Where it was like trying to, in the context of the Great Depression, support unemployed people who
Right.
didn't have steady, regular access to food. And we're talking about the early 1930s, where in the U.S. South, particularly the rural South, particularly in a county like Grundy County in Southeast Tennessee, which had been a key place for coal extraction industries in the U.S. South for decades prior to that, and convict labor and like all kinds of exploitative
Yeah.
practices against people and land. Highlander was like trying to intervene to help people like meet their basic needs, but also to through that process engage in like long haul like rearrangement of the economic, social, and cultural order. So um, there would be people who would historically be described as laborers in a range of different trades, working alongside or in class, so to speak, or in workshops alongside people who were PhDs in religion, who were thinking about how to, transform the church for the purposes of the social, a new social order. And then over the years, I think that what happened is that through the work in accompanying the Southern labor movement, the CIO, in Highlander's earliest years, it was very much like a recognition that there would be no economic justice without a racial justice frame, right? So like when
Absolutely.
bringing
Yeah.
black and white workers together, that what starts to happen is that people start to say like, if as long as our workplaces are segregated, as long as our ability to shift governance or elect people is restricted by these Jim Crow laws, we can have all the goals we want as a labor movement, but we're not going to have all of these other aims. And that's not to say, that's not even to get into the conversation about the labor movement at that time's own
Right.
like segregationist practices. And so I think that like there's a way to understand Highlander as having kind of in segmented ways accompanied different movements over time. But
Hmm.
really, Highlanders prioritize certain movements in terms of resources and accompaniment, but have been working across movements and across front lines for 93 years. So
93 years.
it very much happens, even in my own experience as a program participant in the early 2000s. I was doing more rural organizing in a post-industrial community, really focusing on questions of gentrification.
Hmm.
but with people who are fighting back against police brutality in parts of Kentucky, and then other people who are like recovering and were workers who were part of the Gulf Coast recovery in the wake of Katrina back in the in
Early two.
2005 2008.
Yeah,
And all of those different people, we would yeah, absolutely, all of our movements in the ways that we perceive the world affected each other. Yeah, for sure.
absolutely. So there's something symbolic about you guys being located in Appalachia. It's a I live in Appalachia. It's a region that is oftentimes stereotyped, misunderstood. A lot of times it's demonized and otherized. How has the geography and the culture of the South, specifically Appalachia, shaped the school's approach in organization and solidarity?
Yeah, Highlander's always been in like southern central Appalachia, so Grundy County is kind of on the border of Middle Tennessee and southern Appalachia. And then we had to move to Knox County after the state revoked our charter and took the land in 1961. But we were in Knoxville for ten years, and then we've been where we are today in Newmarket since 1971, and just in late 2024 reclaimed some acreage of our original campus in Grundy County. So we're now kind of in two places, trying to figure out like what it looks like and what it means to run two campuses and do the work like that. But I would say one thing that's real is that Highlanders had to, well, Highlander has chosen specifically to work in rural contexts, in small town contexts, in a way that, and from a rural and small town context. So there's also what makes us a little different than a lot of longer serving organizations is that we've been in the rural South for 83 out of our 93 years. Knoxville was a moment where Highlander leased a house to continue its operations in the 60s, but still was paying really close attention to what it looked like to accompany, for example, SNCC, Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, in or the Freedom Rides, or any number of communities and frontline organizers who were doing work across the rural South. When people talk about like the environmental work that Highlander accompanied in the 70s and 80s and still today, a lot of it was throughout rural central Appalachia, but also in trying to draw connections between extraction-based industries in Appalachia and extraction-based industries in the Gulf or beyond, even outside of the U.S., like in Wales and in India and other places where corporate extraction-based industries have operated from and impacted people. So I think, I mean, I don't think there's one way to describe Appalachia, just like there's no one way to describe a single individual. There's no one way to describe the U.S. South. You got Texas all the way up to Maryland, Florida, Central Appalachia is part of the South, that kind of thing. So I think that the among the ways to describe the impact of that is that we're a reflection of our people, which is like many identities and individual lived experiences intersecting, and therefore Highlanders sought to be, and I think really has pushed the envelope on the question of intersectional organizing and connectivity. And I think that's because Central Appalachia experiences that. There's no way to talk about like indigenous rights and Black freedom struggle without talking about Central Appalachia. There's no way to talk about that without also talking about the rest of the African diaspora throughout the South, or Detroit or LA. So there's like a lot of ways that Highlanders as an Appalachian-based organization really reflects the myriad realities of Appalachia while also being grounded in the context of it. So I think it's made Highlander a little bit more aware, I think, of the short, mid, and long-term impacts of extraction-based industries. So I think if you think about, what we're really facing as a species is the long-term impact of like climate disaster expedited and exacerbated by fossil fuel industries. And Highlander's been in the context of that from the very beginning. So I think that's positioned Highlander to have some understanding of that in terms of whereas other organizations or other parts of the country may not have had those direct experiences. But there's other different ways to think about that. But I think the rural through line is real. I think the extraction based industries and the impact on people and planet is a through line. And I think also like my experience as a Southerner, I'm not from the mountains, but my experience as a Southerner is that like cultural work and cultural strategies are what set Southern organizing models and approaches. They set us apart a little bit from other parts of the U.S. Not to minimize other dope and rad organizing outside of the South, but I think cultural work, cultural organizing, cultural strategies has been a uniquely Southern thing, and by that I mean like, what's it mean to leverage the use of art and song and food production and theater and combine that with our faith and spiritual traditions to shift policy and practices that came from like 93 years worth of synthesis of work of Highlander being a cultural institution in addition to like a social movement organizing school. Like we've always also understood ourselves as a cultural institution. And that's a uniquely Appalachian and Southern thing, I think, for sure.
It really is.
Yeah.
I've been living in the South for about 10 years, 15 years now, and it's definitely unique to this area. Last question.
Sure.
When today's organizers walk into Highlander, knowing the footsteps that they're walking in, of Martin Luther King, Rosa Parks, etc., what do you want them to come away with? Do you want them to feel inspired? Do you want them to feel like there's pressure? Or is there something else?
I want people to feel accountable to our ancestors and those who came before us as much as I want the next generation to hold our current generation accountable to the work of social transformation, right? Like, I don't want people to feel intimidated by that accountability, but I do feel like we want people to come and not be in like awe and reverence of some shrine or something like that, but more like, not only did the Dr. Kings and the Rosa Parkses and the Septima Clarks and the Bob Moseses and Lucille Thornburgs and all these amazing like organizers and wizards from organizing and social movement past come here as students, but they also governed the organization. Rosa Parks was a board member after she was a program participant. Septima Clark was a staff person and then joined the board later on, and program participants and educators and organizers coming together to think through how to leverage the best of ourselves towards new conditions that we can create together is something that people who have names but are not recorded in the books have been doing through Highlander for almost 100 years. Like, I want people to know that they're part of a bigger story and uniquely positioned to shape their own individual and collective destinies together every time they come to Highlander, and also to hold Highlander accountable to being with them in their communities, right? So it's like, I don't want people to walk away saying, I can't do this work now that I'm not a Highlander. That's actually like counter to the point. What we want people to do is to feel like they've gotten what they need to do the next faithful thing around social change, and then to bring that back, sum it up, learn it together, and then plot some new plans to do that work, and just see themselves as part of a broader community of people who are committed to a new South and a new Appalachia and a new, Turtle Island and world, So I want people to feel like they're part of something. I don't want people to feel like have to join something, if that makes any sense. They're two different things. Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah.
Well, thank you for coming on. We had Allyn Maxwell Steele, the co-executive director of Highlander School. Thank you so much for your time, sir.
Thank you, Anthony. It was a pleasure. Thank you so much.
Thank you.